I inherited 300 acres of woods, and the people living next to it honestly believed it was theirs. They had trails running through it, benches bolted into the ground, little wooden signs that said "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Nature Preserve." The only problem was my name was on the deed. When my grandfather, Walter Hayes, passed away, nobody expected much drama. He lived in a modest ranch house outside of Millbrook County, the kind of place with peeling white paint and a porch swing that creaked even when nobody was sitting on it. Most folks assumed he'd leave the house, a pickup truck, maybe a few $1,000s in a savings account. And he did. But buried in the paperwork was something else. 300 acres of wooded land stretching behind the newer development called Silver Run Estates. Silver Run wasn't there when I was a kid. Back then, that land was just woods. Thick oak and hickory, deer trails, a creek that flooded in the spring. My granddad used to take me out there on Saturdays with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He'd point with his chin and say, "See that ridge? That's ours. See that creek bend? Ours too." He never bragged about it. He just said it like it was a fact of gravity. Over time, the county grew. Developers came sniffing around. Paved roads cut through fields. And eventually Silver Run Estates appeared right along our boundary line. Big houses, vinyl fences, mailboxes that all matched. A homeowners association with bylaws thicker than a church Bible. But here's the part that matters. When the developer built Silver Run, he never bought my grandfather's land. He built right up to the old barbed wire fence that marked our boundary. And then he stopped. For years, that fence just sat there, half swallowed by vines. The new homeowners looked out their back windows and saw nothing but trees. No house, no movement, just forest. And I guess after enough time passes, people start assuming that empty means unclaimed. I didn't even know how far things had gone until a week after the funeral. I drove out there alone. The will had just been recorded at the county clerk's office, and I figured I should at least walk the property, make sure everything was in order. I parked along the gravel shoulder near the edge of Silver Run. The entrance sign was polished stone with gold lettering. There were little American flags stuck into the landscaping beds. It looked proud, organized, controlled. Then I stepped past the old fence line and into the trees. The first thing I saw was a wooden post with a map nailed to it. At the top it read Cedar Ridge Community Preserve. Below that was a neatly printed trail map, color-coded paths looping through my woods like veins. Blue trail, red loop, family path. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so bold. They had nailed the sign directly into a white oak that had to be at least 80 years old. I kept walking. About a quarter mile in, I found a bench. Solid cedar. Fresh bolts. Someone had poured concrete footings to anchor it down. A little plaque on the back said, "Donated by the Keller family in loving memory of Max." Max, I assumed, was a golden retriever. I stood there in the quiet and tried to sort out what I was feeling. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was something closer to disbelief. Like walking into your garage and finding your neighbor hosting a barbecue without telling you. By the time I circled back, I'd counted 3 more benches, 2 birdhouses mounted high up, and painted markers tacked to trees guiding hikers along. Nobody had asked permission. Nobody had knocked on my grandfather's door. They had just absorbed it. That evening I dug through my granddad's file cabinet. The deed was clean. No easements. No public access agreements. No recorded shared use. The land was still zoned mixed agricultural with a recreational overlay possibility, which meant it had options, but nothing had been granted to Silver Run. The next morning, I drafted a letter to the Silver Run Homeowners Association. I kept it polite, professional. I introduced myself as the legal heir to the Hayes property, clarified the boundary lines, attached a copy of the recorded deed, and requested removal of all signage and structures placed on the land without authorization. I didn't accuse anyone of trespassing. I didn't threaten. I assumed this was some kind of misunderstanding that would be cleared up with paperwork. A week later, I received an email from the HOA president, a man named Brent Callahan. The tone wasn't apologetic. He wrote that the wooded area had been openly accessed and maintained by Silver Run residents for over a decade. That homeowners had invested time and money improving the trails. That the preserve had become an integral part of the community's identity and property values. Then came the line that made me sit back in my chair. Given the long-term, uninterrupted use by our residents, we believe the area functions as de facto common space. De facto, I read that word 3 times. It was the kind of language that sounds official enough to intimidate someone who doesn't know better. The kind of language that counts on you not pushing back. I called the number at the bottom of his email. He answered on the second ring. Brent Callahan speaking. Yeah, Brent, this is Luke Hayes. I got your message. Ah, Mr. Hayes. I was expecting your call. His voice was smooth, confident, the kind of man who chaired meetings and enjoyed it. I just want to be clear, I said. You understand that long-term use doesn't transfer ownership, right? There was a pause. Not long. Just enough. Well, he said, community reliance does create certain expectations. Expectations, I said, aren't deeds. Another pause. Our attorney may see it differently. That was the first time I felt it shift from misunderstanding to conflict. After we hung up, I drove back out to the property. Families were walking the trails. Kids on bikes. A couple with trekking poles like they were in a national park. They smiled at me as they passed, completely unaware they were on land that legally belonged to someone else. And I realized something uncomfortable. If I did nothing, this would only get harder. Because the longer you let people believe something is theirs, the more they resent you when you remind them it isn't. Standing there in the shade of those trees my grandfather loved, I understood that this wasn't just about acreage. It was about precedent. About whether ownership means anything if you're too polite to enforce it. So I ordered a full professional survey. And that's when things started to escalate. The survey crew showed up on a Tuesday morning with bright orange vests and equipment that looked like it belonged on a NASA launch pad. Tripods, laser levels, GPS units mounted on poles. They moved slowly and methodically, cutting sight lines through brush, hammering in stakes topped with neon ribbon that fluttered like warning flags. I walked with them for most of the day. One of the guys, a quiet older surveyor named Dennis, carried a laminated copy of the original plat map. He tapped it with his finger and said, "Your granddad kept this boundary clean. Straight lines. No ambiguity. That fence line over there, that's textbook. Textbook." There's something comforting about hearing that word when you're standing in the middle of a dispute. By late afternoon, the corners were marked. Every bend in the property line was staked and logged. The bright markers cut through the illusion like highlighter on a contract. If anyone bothered to look, it was obvious where Silver Run ended and my land began. And yet the following Saturday, hikers still walked right past the new stakes. I stood near the main trail entrance and watched. A woman in yoga pants slowed down when she saw the orange ribbon. She glanced around, hesitated for half a second, then stepped over the invisible line and kept going. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it complicated. It was habitual, familiar. The woods had become part of their routine. Morning walks, dog paths, Instagram backdrops in the fall. That afternoon, I got a certified letter from Brent. Silver Run HOA formally disputes the restrictive interpretation of boundary enforcement. It began. The letter cited community investment, safety improvements, and implied prescriptive use. It suggested that restricting access would negatively impact property values and community well-being. Implied prescriptive use. Now we were in legal vocabulary territory. I called my attorney, Sarah Whitman. I'd met her once at a zoning hearing years ago. She had a habit of listening without interrupting, which I appreciated. After I explained everything, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Okay. First, breathe. Second, they're bluffing." She pulled up state statutes on adverse possession and prescriptive easements. In Millbrook County, someone claiming adverse possession had to prove open, notorious, exclusive, and hostile use for a continuous statutory period. And hostile didn't mean angry. It meant without permission. Has anyone ever given them permission? She asked. No. Has your grandfather ever signed anything granting access? No. Did he ever acknowledge their use in writing? No. She nodded. Then they don't meet the threshold. Not even close. Long-term use isn't ownership. It's just long-term use. But she also warned me about something else. Legal strength doesn't always prevent legal expense. If the HOA board wanted a posture, they could drag things out. Send letters. Threaten litigation. Make it uncomfortable enough that I might prefer to compromise. And that's when the idea started forming. If access was the emotional core of their argument, maybe I didn't need to shut the door. Maybe I just needed to change the terms. I spent the next 2 weeks studying zoning codes. The land was classified as mixed agricultural, But there was a recreational overlay option that allowed limited commercial outdoor activities with proper permitting. Guided hikes, seasonal camping, managed hunting zones, environmental education programs. The more I read, the clearer it became. My grandfather had sat on potential he never used. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. I wasn't in the same position. I partnered with a conservation consultant named Miguel Alvarez, a former park ranger who now helped private landowners develop sustainable recreation plans. We walked the property together one humid afternoon, cicadas buzzing overhead. "You've got good forest structure here," he said, stepping over a fallen log. "Mature canopy, healthy understory. But these informal trails? They're causing erosion in a few spots." He pointed to a slope where soil had worn thin. "If you're going to allow access," he continued, "it needs management. Controlled entry points, liability waivers, clear signage, parking outside the subdivision so you're not funneling traffic through their streets." We sketched out a plan right there on the hood of my truck. A managed outdoor recreation park, limited daily passes, annual memberships, guided hiking groups on weekends, primitive campsites by permit only, licensed seasonal hunting in designated zones to manage deer overpopulation, educational workshops for local schools. It wouldn't be Disneyland in the woods. It would be structured, responsible, profitable. Most importantly, it would be undeniably mine. Before filing any permits, I made one decisive move. I installed a gate, not a cheap chain across a path. A solid steel ranch gate mounted between two heavy posts at the primary trail entrance closest to Silver Run. Beside it, a sign that read private property. No public access without authorization. The reaction was immediate. Within 48 hours, my phone started lighting up with unknown numbers. Emails flooded in. Some polite, some not. One message read, "How dare you lock us out of our preserve?" Our preserve. The HOA called an emergency meeting and invited me to attend. I went. The clubhouse at Silver Run smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. Folding chairs were arranged in rows. About 50 residents showed up. Brent stood at the front with a printed agenda. When he saw me walk in, his smile tightened. "Luke, thank you for joining us." I took a seat near the back. Brent cleared his throat and addressed the room. "As many of you know, recent actions have restricted access to Cedar Ridge Preserve. We are currently reviewing legal options to restore community rights." Restore. When he opened the floor for discussion, hands shot up. A woman stood first. "We bought here because of that green space. It was in the listing." Another man added, "My kids learned to ride their bikes on those trails. You can't just take that away." I raised my hand. Brent hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." I stood slowly. "First, I'm not taking anything away that legally belonged to you. That land has been in my family for 3 generations. There's no recorded easement, no shared use agreement. I verified that with the county." Murmurs rippled through the room. I continued, "I understand it feels like part of your community. But feeling doesn't change a deed." Brent stepped in. "With respect, Luke, community reliance over a decade creates equitable considerations." "Equitable considerations," I repeated. "That's not ownership." He held my gaze. "We are prepared to pursue prescriptive easement claims. And we are prepared to defend against them," I said evenly. The room grew quiet. Then I added something they weren't expecting. "However, I am developing a managed recreation program that will allow controlled access once permits are finalized." The shift in the air was subtle but real. "What do you mean controlled?" someone asked. "Permits, entry fees, liability waivers, structured use." "You're going to charge us?" A man near the aisle blurted out. I didn't raise my voice. "If you want access to land you don't own, yes." It wasn't said with malice. It was said with clarity. Brent's jaw tightened. "This feels punitive." "It's not punitive," I replied. "It's responsible management." After the meeting, as people filed out, a few residents approached me privately. Some were still upset. Others were curious. One older gentleman shook my hand and said quietly, "For what it's worth, son, you're within your rights." Folks just don't like being reminded of boundaries. Boundaries. That word stuck with me. The following month was a blur of paperwork. County hearings, environmental assessments, insurance negotiations. Miguel helped refine the trail layout to minimize erosion and protect sensitive habitat areas. And through it all, the gate stayed closed. Silver Run's attorney sent one more letter threatening action, citing community expectation and potential diminution of property value. Sarah responded with a concise summary of statutory requirements and case law precedent. The tone was calm, almost clinical. No lawsuit ever materialized. By late summer, the permits were approved. Cedar Ridge Outdoor Preserve would officially open in October. Annual passes were priced reasonably. Day passes even more so. Residents of Millbrook County received a discount. I made sure of that. And then, one crisp fall morning, I unlocked the gate for the first time under the new system. That first morning we opened, the air had that sharp October edge to it, the kind that smells like dry leaves and wood smoke even if nobody's burning anything. The sun was just coming up over the ridge, lighting the tops of the trees in gold, while the lower trails were still tucked in shadow. Miguel was there early with a clipboard. I had a folding table set up beside the new gravel parking lot we'd built off County Road 18, deliberately nowhere near Silver Run's entrance. There was a sign now. Not flashy, just simple carved wood. Cedar Ridge Outdoor Preserve. Managed access property. Underneath that, smaller letters. Welcome. Respect the land. At 8 a.m. on the dot, the first car pulled in. And I won't lie, my stomach tightened a little when I saw the Silver Run parking decal on the windshield. Out stepped a woman I recognized from the HOA meeting, the one who'd said her kids learned to ride bikes on the trails. She walked toward the table with cautious energy, like she wasn't sure if we were enemies or just neighbors who'd had a bad week. Morning, she said. Morning. She looked at the sign, then back at me. So, how does this work? I explained the permits. Day pass, $10. Annual family pass, discounted for county residents. Liability waiver required. Stay on marked trails. Campsites by reservation only. She listened quietly, then pulled out her wallet. I guess this is fair, she said, almost to herself. We probably should have asked in the first place. That sentence hit me harder than the angry emails ever did. Probably should have asked. By noon, we'd sold 37 day passes. By the end of the first weekend, almost 100. A surprising number of those buyers were Silver Run residents. Some came reluctantly. Others came curious. A few came with folded arms and tight smiles, like they were testing whether the woods still felt like theirs. But here's the thing. Once people stepped onto properly maintained trails, once they saw the erosion repaired, the new footbridges over the creek, the clearly marked boundaries and educational signs about native species, something shifted. It didn't feel like something had been taken away. It felt upgraded. Miguel's design routed foot traffic more intelligently. We closed off fragile areas that had been trampled before. We installed discrete wildlife cameras and started tracking deer movement. When hunting season opened in a limited zone far from residential edges, it was done legally, safely, transparently. The overpopulation numbers dropped within months, and the underbrush began to recover. For the first time in years, the land wasn't just being used. It was being managed. Revenue from passes covered insurance, maintenance, and even a part-time ranger to monitor activity on busy weekends. I kept detailed books. Transparent. Accountable. Ironically, some of the loudest early critics became regular visitors. One Saturday afternoon in late November, I was walking the Blue Loop when I ran into Brent Callahan himself. He was standing near the old cedar bench with the plaque for Max the Golden Retriever. He looked different without a blazer and meeting agenda, just a fleece jacket and hiking boots. We stood there for a second, neither of us sure who would speak first. Didn't expect to see you out here, I said lightly. He gave a small shrug. My wife bought an annual pass. I nodded. It's a nice day. He glanced around. The leaves were at peak color, reds and oranges bleeding through the canopy. You've made improvements, he admitted. We've tried to be responsible. There was a pause, longer this time. I'll be honest, he said finally. When you put up that gate, it felt like an attack. It wasn't an attack, I replied. It was a boundary. He exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh. I suppose from our side it felt like something we'd come to rely on was suddenly gone. I get that, I said. But reliance isn't ownership. He nodded slowly. I know. That conversation didn't end in friendship, but it ended in something better. Recognition. By winter, Cedar Ridge was stable. The county featured it in a local newsletter about responsible land stewardship. A nearby elementary school scheduled field trips for spring. The preserve had become something real, something structured, something that respected both private ownership and community access. And yet, the tension never completely disappeared. There were still murmurs online. A few Silver Run residents insisted I'd exploited the situation, that I could have simply granted free access and been a good neighbor. That charging fees, even modest ones, was greedy. I wrestled with that more than I expected. Late one evening, I walked out alone, no clipboard, no permits, just me and the sound of wind moving through branches. I stopped at the ridge my grandfather used to point at when I was a kid. See that ridge? That's ours. Back then, ownership meant privacy, solitude, maybe a sense of quiet pride. Now it meant paperwork, insurance premiums, community scrutiny, responsibility. I asked myself a hard question out there in the dark. Could I have just let them keep using it for free? Sure. Would that have honored the land? I'm not so sure, because unmanaged use was slowly damaging it. Erosion creeping down slopes. Trash occasionally left behind. Dogs off leash during nesting season. Good people mostly, but unstructured access always drifts. The fees weren't about squeezing neighbors. They were about sustainability. About making sure Cedar Ridge would still be standing healthy when I was the one riding a will someday. The following spring, something unexpected happened. Silver Run's HOA requested a meeting. This time, not to threaten. They wanted to discuss a formal partnership. Volunteer days for trail maintenance. Educational workshops hosted jointly. Even the possibility of subsidizing a limited number of passes for low-income families within their community. I sat across from Brent again in that same clubhouse that had once felt like hostile territory. We were both quieter now. He slid a proposal across the table. We should have approached this differently from the start, he said. Assumptions were made. On both sides, maybe, I replied. He shook his head slightly. No, it was your land. That part was never ambiguous. We just didn't want to see it. There it was. Not a dramatic apology. Not a cinematic victory speech. Just acknowledgement. And honestly, that felt more satisfying than winning a lawsuit ever would have. Today, Cedar Ridge Outdoor Preserve is thriving. The forest is healthier than it's been in decades. Wildlife surveys show stronger diversity. The creek runs clearer where we stabilized the banks. Silver Run residents still walk the trails. They just check in first. Sometimes I stand by the gate at sunset and watch families head back to their cars, boots muddy, kids tired in that good way that only comes from being outside all day. And I think about how close this came to turning ugly, how easily it could have spiraled into years of courtrooms and resentment. Instead, it became something else. A reminder that ownership isn't just about having your name on paper. It's about deciding what kind of steward you're going to be when someone challenges it. Now here's the part I'm still wrestling with, and I'd honestly like to hear what you think. Was I right to lock it down first? Should I have tried to negotiate before installing the gate? Some people still believe I turned a shared treasure into a business. Others say I protected something that would have slowly been lost. So I'm curious. If you inherited land that an entire neighborhood had been using for years without permission, what would you have done? Would you have let it slide to keep the peace? Or would you have drawn the line, even knowing it might make you the villain for a while? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you probably think. And if you've ever dealt with HOA drama, property disputes, or anything where boundaries got blurry, I'd really like to hear your story too. Because if there's one thing this taught me, it's that boundaries don't create conflict. They reveal it. And what you do after that, that's the part that defines you.